Good morning. It's February the 18th, 2021, and our reading today is in Joshua chapter 4. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priest stood, and to carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Now the priests who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people, just as Moses had directed Joshua. The people hurried over, and as soon as all of them had crossed the ark of the Lord, and the priests came to the other side while the people watched, the men of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over, armed in front of the Israelites, as Moses had directed them. About 40,000 armed for battle crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for war. That day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him all the days of his life, just as they had revered Moses. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests carrying the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up out of the Jordan." And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran in flood as before. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their fathers, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." Amen. Well, this chapter divides nicely into two halves. First of all, verses 1 to 14, we see the priests in the water. For as long as they are in obedience to the commandment of God, as long as the priests are in the water, then the miracle of the drying up of the Jordan River continues. We also find out why God commanded in chapter 3 and verse 12. Let me read it to you again. "Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe." We now find out why that had to happen. It was so that these 12 men could gather up 12 stones from the riverbed, verse 3, obviously symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel, and how God had rescued in a united way all Israel on this occasion, and then how those stones were to be erected on the other side of the Jordan as a future national memorial of God's mighty works on behalf of his people. And also, that's rather grand and sort of national, which it will be, but also to inspire a sort of catechism, a question and answer teaching with all future generations within their families, with the children in mind. This is mentioned in verse 6 and in verse 21. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? These things were to serve as a sign pointing back to their unique history and how God had intervened and rescued them and his mighty acts on their behalf. And it was meant to inspire and educate and develop faith in the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. I wonder if we can think of similar things that exist, that God has commanded, memorials, stones, buildings, altars, maybe even in our own experience, church buildings and things like that, not really commanded by God in this sense, but they serve a similar function. They are signs. They point beyond themselves to something greater to do with the grace and the glory of our God. And also, this reminds us of the great importance of the family in God's purposes for his people. For it is mostly within that context that children are to be taught in this question and answer fashion. So that's the priests in the water, verses 1 to 14. And then, of course, we have the priests coming out of the water, verses 15 to 24. Again, at every point, we see the thoroughgoing obedience of these people. There's Joshua, who is listening and obeying every fine detail that's given to him by the Lord. And we could say the same about the priests and all the people in their response to Joshua. That's the sort of chain of command as we have it here. And when we look at verse 18, we see that this mighty miracle that God has done, actually, it's like a coin and it's got two sides to it. Because there's not only the miracle going in, there's also the miracle coming out. Verse 18, and the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran in flood as before. So there's a miracle coming out, and there's the miracle of the water of the Jordan River flowing again. And all of this obviously is reminding us this was not a natural phenomenon. There's no human explanation of this. This is God miraculously pouring out his favor and power on behalf of his people. Finally, at Gilgal, that's the place where they end up, the 12 stone memorial is set up. And what is the purpose of all of this? It's there in verses 23 and 24 as the chapter ends. It is to be an echo of what happened before at the Red Sea. Verse 23. It's similar in some ways. It's very different in other ways, but there are similarities. The parting of the water, all of God's people going through. It's a miracle done by God, but he works through the faith and obedience of his people, and every single one of them comes through. You can see the parallels. But the real punchline is verse 24. He did this so that all the peoples might know and fear the Lord. So we have the Red Sea looking back to the past. And then we have this saving purpose into the future. We also have memorials today, don't we? We have things that the Lord has given to us. And this is quite literally that he has commanded now. Things that he says we are to use, physical things, to remember and to worship him, to serve him, and to be faithful to him today. Of course, I'm talking about the bread and the wine. Look at it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'll read just one verse, verse 26. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.